I remember that day in every detail, even though 7 years have passed. It all started because I overslept. Yeah, simple as that. I was late for my shift at the observatory, and if it hadn't been for that spilled coffee, humanity might have gone much longer without realizing that something out there had woken up. That night, everything felt off. The sky too clear, the instruments too quiet. Even my colleagues were suspiciously polite. I turned on the spectral analyzer, and the monitor displayed the usual solar activity charts. But among them, a spike. Not massive, not catastrophic, just strange, like someone blinking through the radio static. I zoomed in, and my heart clenched. The signal wasn't natural. It repeated at perfectly even intervals, mathematically precise, as if someone beyond Neptune's orbit was flipping a switch on schedule. And whoever it was, they clearly knew we could listen. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a satellite, maybe background noise from old probes, but the longer I stared at the graph, the stronger the feeling grew. This wasn't random noise. There was rhythm. It almost breathed. And the worst part, I could feel it resonate inside me, as if I wasn't hearing it through the equipment, but directly in my head. I exported the data and sent it to the International Monitoring Center, but I stayed there, frozen in front of the screen. An hour later, I got a reply. The signal had been detected at 4 other points on Earth. Observatories in Australia, Chile, Canada, and even the lunar station confirmed it. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a reflection. It was something that had awakened. That was the first time I understood that the phrase, "the silence of space," was just a convenient lie. Space doesn't stay silent. It listens. The next day, the news feeds exploded with headlines, but officially, of course, nothing was confirmed. They talked about a technical malfunction, solar flares, scientists still searching for the source. But inside the observation network, we saw more. The signal was getting louder. It repeated every 3 hours, and patterns began to appear in the spectrum, as if someone was trying to tune into the right frequency. I spent a sleepless night analyzing fragments and suddenly realized this wasn't just a pulse sequence, it was structured data. It was encoded, old and crude, reminiscent of Earth's early digital transmissions from the 21st century. As if someone had spent millions of years adapting to our communication systems. Or worse, we had once adapted to theirs. That thought sent chills down my spine. When the signal reached its peak strength, our telescope captured a faint glow in the outer Kuiper belt. At first, we thought it was an icy body reflecting starlight, but it wasn't a reflection. The light pulsed at the same frequency as the signal. Where there should have been empty space for billions of years, something was moving. I sat there, forehead pressed to the glass, not understanding why I felt not terror, but awe. Maybe that's the madness of a scientist, seeing beauty in an approaching nightmare. Back then, we didn't know what had awakened. No one did. We thought it might be an automated system from an ancient civilization, a forgotten beacon, a technological capsule. But the more we observed, the clearer it became. This wasn't a machine. It was intelligence. It wasn't sending a signal. It was calling. And the call wasn't in words. It was a feeling, expectation, as if something was waking up and remembering it had left something important here. When the phrase, "the awakening of the ancients," first appeared, I laughed. The media loved it. Dramatic, ominous, perfect for headlines. But as time passed, laughing became harder. Each new transmission changed slightly. There were spikes matching the biorhythms of living beings. The data models began to resemble pulses, then drawings, as if someone were trying to sketch shapes, lines, spirals. It all pointed in one direction, toward the center of the solar system, toward us. I stopped feeling like a researcher and started feeling like a witness to something ancient that should have stayed a legend, not a scientific record. And the most disturbing thing, that rhythm, that cosmic heartbeat, never stopped. It became part of the silence Earth lives within. Since then, I'm no longer sure stars simply burn. Sometimes I think they sleep. And one of them has just begun to wake up. I still remember the moment when the message first appeared on the screen. I was in the lab, eating cold, instant noodles from a plastic cup, fighting sleep while the servers hummed monotonously. Everything looked normal until the red data indicator started flashing, not on schedule, not from a designated range, but from deep interplanetary space, where even radio noise usually drifts like an old man napping in the sun. The data packet was short, compressed to the limit, but with perfect structural precision. Nature doesn't do that. When I decoded the first bits, I felt it, a gaze piercing straight through me. The text didn't appear right away. The symbols unraveled from the code as if the computer itself hesitated to reveal their meaning. Then, the screen simply displayed one phrase. You are using what is not yours. Return the sun. I stared at those words for what must have been 10 minutes. Then I laughed, loudly, nervously, almost choking. Of course, space was joking. Anyone could have a data glitch, but me. I get a mystical ultimatum from the stars. When I showed that message to my colleagues, the mood in the lab changed instantly. At first, there was nervous laughter, then silence. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone knew. The transmission structure was too complex to come from any Earth source. No satellite could send something like that. Besides, the signal wasn't coming from within the solar system. It came from far out, from the edge of the Kuiper Belt, the same place where that strange heartbeat-like rhythm had appeared before. We aimed every available antenna in that direction, but soon the signal repeated. Only now with a different frequency signature, as if someone deliberately changed the tone to make sure we were listening. And again, the same phrase, return the sun. Simple, clear, absurdly absurd. Return the sun. To whom? How do you even return a star? I remembered old myths where gods or spirits stole the sun, but now that nonsense didn't sound like a fairy tale. It sounded like an instruction. And the more we analyzed it, the more terrifying it became. The message was meant for us, for humanity. Of course, the governments classified everything. The news talked about anomalous radio interference and sensor calibration errors. But within the scientific community, panic broke out. I attended a closed meeting where military officials and astrophysicists argued until they were shouting. Some insisted it was a hoax, an advanced hacker simulation. Others presented data showing the signal had spectral signatures not found on Earth. And then there were the ones who stayed silent. Those silent people disappeared later. They just didn't show up for work again, their offices sealed, their names erased from the system. I don't know what they found, but I felt it had something to do with the message itself. When I stayed late that night and reread those words, I felt uneasy. They didn't sound like a threat, they sounded like a reminder. As if something ancient was simply demanding the return of a toy it had left behind millions of years ago. A few days later, the signal repeated, but this time the message came with an image. Not a photo, not a video, more like an abstract pattern of lines spinning into a spiral as if someone was showing a diagram. At first glance, it was just geometry, but when I sped up the visualization, the lines formed a shape resembling the sun, except inside wasn't a core, but something like a mechanism. My colleagues and I debated for hours, but the more we examined it, the clearer it became. It was a construct, an energy engine on a colossal scale. The sun, in that image, looked like an artificial object. That's when I first allowed myself to think it might be true. Maybe the sun isn't just a star, but a device built by someone before us, and that someone now wants it back. I tried not to think about it, but it's hard when every newspaper, every channel whispers about the signal from the void. The world became strangely quiet. People stopped talking about politics, arguing about the climate. Even the markets froze. There was this feeling in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Observatories began detecting microscopic fluctuations in solar radiation, as if someone was lightly turning the brightness knob. Scientists tried to stay calm, but I saw their faces. We all knew it wasn't coincidence. That night, I sat on the roof, staring at the sun, or rather, at its reflection in the telescope data. It looked calm, familiar, warm. And yet, deep inside, I felt that someone beyond the light's edge was watching us, and maybe waiting for an answer. Sometimes, I think panic is just the brain's way of admitting it no longer understands anything. In the first days after the message from the void, I slept 2 hours a night and ate whatever didn't need heating. The world seemed frozen, waiting for something unthinkable, but on the surface, everything looked normal. The news talked about the weather, politicians about stability, and the sun kept shining like nothing happened, only that nothing started to feel wrong. People looked up at the sky longer than before. I saw it from the park across from the observatory, passers-by tilting their heads trying to spot something off. Maybe the solar disk looked dimmer, maybe the sunspots moved differently. It seemed funny, but the laughter stuck in my throat. Because I'd noticed it too, the radiation had changed, uneven, unstable. In the lab, the spectral instruments detected micro-oscillations that shouldn't exist. The sun seemed to tremble, or worse, someone was shaking it by an invisible thread. Officially, we were ordered to stay silent. Everyone with access to the raw data had to sign off on 10 levels of secrecy. Documents, protocols, even emails, all deleted, leaving only blank files behind. But astrophysicists have a bad habit. We keep copies. We're too used to doubting, and in one of those copies, I found something that haunted me for weeks. It was a timeline of solar activity over the past 20 years. I overlaid the new data and realized the changes had started long ago. No one noticed because the sun is too familiar to question. The radiation was shifting in phase, as if some massive mechanism were slowly losing synchronization. And if those numbers were correct, the sun really was working like an engine. A real, engineered one. Not a thermonuclear furnace like we were taught, but something artificial, sustaining the reaction by principles we don't even understand. I tried to report it to my superiors, but they wouldn't listen. One of the supervisors said that such talk undermined public order. Another advised me to take a vacation. That's when I realized they knew. Not everything, but enough to be afraid. Soon, a new internal directive appeared. Halt all ultraviolet range observations. It sounded absurd, since that range provided the most accurate data. Then, they simply shut down part of our equipment, citing maintenance. At that moment, real fear hit me. Not because something threatened the sun, but because I understood that the information control system worked faster than the truth-finding system. Anything that didn't fit the norm was erased, even thoughts. Among scientists, whispers began. Quiet talks behind closed doors. Some believed the message was a hoax, created by some group to cause chaos. Others said it might be an ancient automated beacon left by a long-dead civilization. But I saw the faces of those who knew physics too well to believe in coincidences. They avoided looking out the window where the sun shone. One engineer I worked with told me that during a night observation, he detected a short but powerful pulse directly from the solar corona, something that looked like a control signal. He didn't save the recording. It auto-erased as if someone had interfered remotely. Then he said something that stuck with me. He was sure now the sun wasn't just a star. It was a device, and someone might have started rebooting it. A few weeks later, the first leak happened. On forums, anonymous channels, even in memes, the phrase started popping up, "Return the sun." At first, people joked. Then they started posting videos, slow-motion footage claiming the sunlight had turned colder. Panic spread quietly, like a virus. I'd walk down the street and overhear people saying the government was hiding the truth. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed there was a massive reactor inside the sun. Others said it had already been replaced with an artificial copy after a catastrophe. The scariest part was that none of it sounded insane anymore. It all felt like speculation without evidence, yet too logical to dismiss. And I, a man of science, suddenly realized I couldn't say where imagination ended and reality began. We all became prisoners of the darkness, hidden inside the brightest source of light. Sometimes I climb onto the roof and look at the night sky, trying to feel that forgotten sense of peace again. But it never comes. The world feels filled with a low hum, as if something beneath its surface is slowly awakening, ready to break through. Simple explanations don't work anymore. I've stopped believing in them. We've lived under the light for so long without asking questions, and only now we're starting to understand. Maybe that light isn't ours. Maybe we're just temporary tenants in someone else's world, and perhaps that message from the void wasn't a threat, but a polite reminder that our lease is about to expire. I never thought I'd end up among those who would fly toward the sun itself. Since childhood, it felt like something eternal, like gravity or the smell of rain after heat. But after the message, after the leaks and restrictions, the sun stopped being just a star. It became a question. And when they announced the Helios mission, I applied almost instinctively. Maybe out of professional stubbornness, maybe just to see with my own eyes what we had gotten into. The selection process was brutal. Candidates were screened as if we were going to survive, not just study. And in the end, that's exactly what it was. During the final stage in the training dome, they showed us new data. Around the sun, fields of unknown nature had been detected, not gravitational, not magnetic, not radiation. Something else, like a colossal pattern hidden beneath the surface of light. That's when I first heard the term mechanical signature, and I knew it was no longer theory. Someone had built something there. The flight began with a feeling of unreality. I sat in the capsule, strapped in, unable to shake the thought that it all felt like an experimental movie. Outside the window, void, silent and endless. On the monitors, numbers, parameters, formulas. But behind it all was a simple truth. We were flying toward a star that might not be a star. The closer we got, the more our instruments went haywire. Magnetometers spiked wildly as if someone were yanking the wires. Lighters refused to focus. Yet behind the chaos, a rhythm emerged, repeating with a pattern, as if the sun's heart was beating in sync with some unknown machine. When we entered the corona zone, the sensors screamed, as though someone was trying to silence them. I felt a strange vibration, not physical but internal, like my body was reacting to invisible pressure. Later, I learned everyone felt it too. By the third day of our journey, the communication system failed. Total silence. We found ourselves in a zone where radio waves distorted and signals reflected from the corona came back with a delay and on different frequencies, as if someone had edited them. One of the engineers joked that the sun was talking to us. We just didn't know how to listen. It sounded like a nervous joke back then, but I remembered it, because at some point I heard it too. It was like a hum, rhythmic, steady. Not a sound, more like a vibration in the bones. We turned on a new spectrometer and got a graph that no instrument could explain. The radiation had a clear digital structure, repeating at 24-minute intervals. Not chaos, not random energy. A sequence, as if the sun itself was transmitting a code. When I realized that this code matched the patterns from the "Return the Sun" message, everything inside me flipped. We weren't just approaching a source of light, we were approaching a source of will. When we reached perihelion, everything changed. The temperature outside hit unimaginable levels, but the heat shield held. Suddenly, the image on the main screen warped, like someone brushed water with their hand. And I saw shapes. Not fire, not plasma. Structures. Massive, geometrically perfect forms. Arches, domes, lines disappearing deep into the solar body. They pulsed in rhythm with the radio noise. The entire crew froze. Someone dropped a tablet, someone covered their mouth with their hand. I just couldn't look away. Before us wasn't the chaos of a thermonuclear inferno. It was architecture. Grand, insane architecture made of light and energy, as if God himself had turned into an engineer. That's when I understood the myth of the constructed sun wasn't a theory. It was a memory. And that memory was older than humanity itself. We were forbidden to transmit any of the data, officially because of radio interference, in reality to prevent panic from destroying what was left of order on Earth. But the recordings survived. I secretly downloaded part of the data while the system still obeyed me. And in the final frames, before everything was swallowed by blinding fire, I saw something. Inside the structure, deeper than all layers of the corona, something was moving. Not physical, not tangible, more like a shadow or a will or a thought given form. It moved slowly, as if it knew we were watching. Then, our instruments registered a surge of energy, a pulse, like a greeting. The sun answered us, or whoever lives within it did. And in that moment, I stopped being afraid, because I realized we weren't just studying the past of the universe. We were talking to whoever created it. I still remember the moment the image finally stabilized. We sat there gripping the rails, eyes scorched by the light, but no one blinked. Lines floated on the screen, unnaturally straight for solar plasma. It wasn't a trick of light or a sensor glitch. Something impossible was opening before us, a structure spanning a third of the solar corona. It seemed alive. Every arc, every pattern breathed, like a colossal organism billions of years old. I couldn't believe it was real. Everything we were taught about stars collapsed in seconds. I felt a chill run through my body, even though the cabin temperature was off the charts. And then I understood, the sun doesn't just burn, it works, like a machine, like a mechanism someone once built and turned on. We zoomed in, and the details became clear. The construction consisted of enormous arches resembling nerve fibers, connected into nodes. In the center, something like a core spinning at insane speed, but disobeying the laws of physics. It didn't emit light. It absorbed it. It seemed that the sun shone not by itself, but because that thing inside processed energy and expelled the excess. That's when I thought, if it's an engine, who turned it on? And why is it still running? The equipment was going crazy. Temperature, pressure, gravitational readings, everything was off the charts. The probe barely held together, but no one wanted to turn back. We were hypnotized, unable to look away. Before our eyes wasn't just a miracle, it was proof that humanity was never alone. A few minutes later, we recorded a sudden spike in radiation frequency. An impulse came from the core, and all instruments went dark. Only the cameras kept recording, but the footage turned strange, as if reality itself had cracked inside the lens. In that crack, I saw a shape, unlike anything made by nature or by hands. Hundreds of concentric rings spun in different directions, creating the illusion of breathing. In the center, something like a nest of light, sending out waves of energy. They pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. I realized this was the heart of the sun, not metaphorically, literally. A massive engine operating by laws we couldn't even define. That's when fear hit me, because a heart is always part of something greater. With every passing second, the structure grew more active. It felt like it could sense us. The plasma around it thickened, forming patterns, as if something was trying to communicate through it. Then, a low, resonant hum came through the headphones. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration that went straight through the brain. It triggered a strange familiarity, like an old memory being played from within. I didn't understand its meaning, but I felt no hostility. It was a question. The structure was asking us, not with words or signals, but by its very existence. The probe detected repeating sequences of impulses, and one of the engineers later proved that they matched the same patterns encoded in that first message, "Return the sun." It wasn't just coincidence. It was a response, and it came from within. When the connection started breaking up, I didn't feel panic, only reverent dread. We were standing before something that had existed long before the stars, perhaps even before the universe itself. The engine that powered the sun was older than the concept of time. It didn't just produce energy, It governed it, redistributed it, maintained balance between light and darkness. I saw streams of matter rising from the core, shaping symbols like writing. Maybe it was a record, maybe instructions. But one thing I understood clearly: someone had left this intentionally. Not for us, but in such a way that we could find it. When the flames became unbearably bright, the probe transmitted one last frame. Inside the structure, among the rotating rings, something resembling a human silhouette flickered. And in that instant, I felt its gaze. Not from the outside, from within, as if the star itself looked at me and recognized me. I remember that day down to the smallest detail, because the sky changed, not metaphorically, literally. It became deeper, as if someone had peeled away a thin film that separated us from the rest of the universe. The stars began to shimmer with unnatural clarity, and the observatory instruments registered a strange effect. Space itself began to breathe. No one understood what it meant until that same glow appeared above Earth's orbit. At first, I thought it was a reflection from a satellite or a solar flare, but the object didn't rotate or move. It simply existed, and its presence could be felt on the skin. Even without seeing it directly, you could sense a faint pressure, as if an invisible hand touched the air. That was the moment I realized we weren't observing it. It was observing us. A few hours later, the radiation shifted, and our instruments picked up a new signal. It contained no words, yet its structure was unmistakably artificial. I can't explain the feeling. It was like someone speaking directly to you, not through sound or thought, but through the essence of consciousness itself. The meaning seemed to seep into our minds on its own. We understood. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was an introduction. They were saying they'd come home. I couldn't believe that the word "they" now referred to something real. The envoys, as journalists later called them, weren't bodies in any familiar sense. They looked like clusters of light with constantly shifting geometry. Sometimes it seemed as if a whole world moved within each form, as if miniature stars hid inside them. And yet, I felt they were alive, real. When we decoded the meaning of their message, a chill ran down my spine. They claimed that millions of years ago, they built this beacon we call the sun, not as a source of heat, but as a lighthouse. According to them, humanity didn't arise by chance. It was created, or rather, cultivated under that light. The sun was their gift, their embryonic machine, designed to nurture life and guide the growth of civilization. And now, they had returned to check the result. I didn't know what to think. Half the scientific community dismissed it as a hoax or a trap. But when the envoys began to manipulate solar flows, shifting sunspots and adjusting flares as if by breathing, the skeptics fell silent. The sun obeyed them like a child obeys a parent. For the first time, I didn't feel like a researcher. I felt like a descendant. They told us that at the birth of the universe, billions of such beacons had been placed across galaxies, each at the heart of a young system where life might emerge. Their purpose was simple: to spread light, not just energy, but the very capacity for awareness. I listened, unable to process the idea that we were not an accident, that humanity might be part of an experiment, ancient and unimaginably vast. They said they had slept for eons, waiting for a civilization capable of seeing beyond matter, capable of hearing their call. And now, when the Helios probe reached the solar corona and activated their device, they awoke. It struck me then that everything we thought was exploration was actually the triggering of someone's ancient alarm clock. When they came closer, not as radiant forms but as projections, I realized we had no shared language. Yet we still understood each other. It felt built into us. I looked at their glowing shapes and felt a familiar sadness. They seemed tired, as if they had seen too much, as if they had carried that light through eras when even the universe itself forgot why it existed. One of them approached, or maybe I just felt it, and my mind filled with a simple meaning. You did it. I didn't understand what exactly we had done, but tears came on their own. Not from fear, but from the realization that over billions of years we hadn't lost the purpose for which this flame was lit. When the envoys vanished, space flattened again, and the stars returned to their usual places. Only the sun looked slightly different. It shone a little softer, as if smiling. I stood at the observation post thinking that maybe now it knew who we were. Or perhaps it had always known, just waiting for us to look back. And I suddenly realized that humanity wasn't a cosmic mistake or a random coincidence. We were a message. We were the very light someone once sent so the universe wouldn't fade away in solitude. If someone had told me back then that the sun could take offense, I would have laughed. Then maybe cried, because it turned out it really could. It started when its light began to change, not vanish, just dim, as if someone were lowering its brightness with a remote control. I was working on an orbital observation station then, and our instruments were the first to detect the power drop. At first, no one believed it. Scientists blamed fluctuations in solar activity, sensor errors. But I saw it with my own eyes. Days were growing paler. Even the shadows on Earth seemed uncertain, as if doubting their own existence. Then came a new message. No sound, no voice, but with a clear meaning. They demanded the return of the sun. Return it. As if it were something we could just hand back, like a toy mistakenly taken from the wrong sandbox. The envoys didn't appear again in their luminous forms, but their presence was felt in every burst of radio noise, in every magnetic anomaly. They didn't threaten us. They set conditions. According to them, the sun was a mechanism that had maintained its balance autonomously for millions of years. Now that we had interfered, they couldn't leave it unattended. They said humanity had no right to control what it hadn't created. We had to shut down all systems, restore the core to its original state, and then they would restore harmony. Otherwise, as they put it, the source of light will fade naturally. The phrase was almost poetic, if it hadn't meant the death of all life. I remember standing by the window, looking at the pale spot that once blinded us with its power. The sun looked exhausted, as if it didn't want to belong to anyone anymore. Governments, of course, tried to hide it. First, they claimed it was temporary energy fluctuations, then said the solar cycle had entered a rare minimum phase. But people aren't stupid. Photos began to circulate online. Cold sunrises, slowed winds, frozen leaves in the tropics. Panic rose again, and this time, it couldn't be stopped. Debates broke out in scientific centers. Some insisted we comply, others wanted to resist. I was somewhere in the middle. I wanted to believe we could solve this without a war, but the more I studied the structure of solar radiation, the clearer it became. They really could control it. We saw temperature shifts in the photosphere by fractions of a percent, and those fluctuations matched their signals. It was like the breathing of a living organism that had been ordered to hold its breath. A few weeks later, the sun began losing not just light, but color. It grew whiter, colder, as if something inside it was dying. I couldn't look at it without feeling a strange guilt. It felt like we had done something terrible just by trying to uncover the truth. One of our astrophysicists suggested the ancients weren't threatening us out of anger, but out of fear. If their technology was truly connected to the star's source of energy, any interference could be catastrophic for them. Maybe they were just protecting themselves. But people wouldn't understand that, especially as the world grew darker. Every day, millions of eyes looked up, trying to see whether our sun was still there, or already gone. I could feel humanity losing not just warmth, but its confidence that we had any future at all. When the message repeated, there was no hesitation in it. You made your choice. The light will leave. I don't know how they transmitted it. There were no radio waves, no visual effects. Everything around simply stopped for a few seconds. Even the station's instruments went silent. And then, everything grew quieter. Space had always been silent, but this silence felt different, conscious. I stared at the spectrograph panel as the energy line sank lower, realizing that we had lost. Or maybe we had only just begun to understand what we were part of. We didn't know if the sun could be persuaded to return, didn't know what return even meant to them. But deep inside, I felt that if this was the end, it wasn't sudden. It was one we had chosen ourselves. And maybe that was why the ancients didn't rush to extinguish us completely. They were waiting, testing whether we could preserve the light when it was no longer there. I never thought humanity could end up fighting over a star. We used to argue about oil, water, ideologies, borders, but the sun was always above all that, beyond disputes and control. It simply shone, never choosing sides, and suddenly it turned out that even it could be divided. After the ancients issued their ultimatum, humanity split in half. One side, the so-called humble, believed we had to return the sun like polite tenants who knew it was time to vacate someone else's home. The other side, the keepers, argued that if the sun had fed us for millions of years, it belonged to us by the right of life itself. I was caught between them. To me, both sides seemed right in their own way, and equally insane. Some were willing to turn off the star for the sake of a clear conscience, while others were ready to start an interplanetary war just to prove they could hold on to the flame. I watched it all and felt that our civilization was, for the first time, waging war not against someone else, but against itself. At first, it looked like just another political crisis. New parties emerged, manifestos were written, and statements about moral responsibility flooded the networks. The streets filled with protests. Some banners demanded to return the light to its creators, while others called to protect our sky. But soon, it became something much darker. When it became clear that the sun really was dimming, everyone's patience ran out. Orbital stations began blocking data transmissions, and mutinies broke out in the space fleets. Even among the scientists on the Helios project, arguments erupted. Some secretly leaked information to the humble, others connected to the military defense systems. Everyone believed they were defending the truth. And I just felt the world shrinking. Stations that once exchanged data now exchanged threats. People I used to drink coffee with at conferences began to hate each other. When the sun lost another % of its brightness, patience finally snapped. Earth literally split into two camps. The Union of Return announced the start of an operation to restore universal order. They planned to send an impulse device toward the sun that would completely disable all Earth-based systems affecting its field. A kind of repentance button. In response, the Keepers activated Project Helios Shield, a satellite network armed with thermogravitational generators capable of repelling any interference. I witnessed the first battles flare up above the planet, not for land, but for the right to tell the sun it belonged to us. No one really understood how you could fight over a dying star, but we did. Because people never fight for outcomes, they fight for meaning. I remember the day the sky turned gray, not from weather, from ash. One of the satellites was shot down, and its fragments entered the atmosphere, scattering into thousands of fiery sparks. They fell slowly, like a rain of embers. People watched in silence. That was when I realized the sun wasn't fading because the ancients were taking back its light, but because we were suffocating it ourselves. It was just reflecting what was happening inside us. We had become cold, greedy, and self-righteous, and the light was leaving with it. The scientists, the group I still belonged to back then, kept trying to run analyses, but it was becoming clear that science was powerless against human stupidity. We had proven we could measure a star's energy, but we couldn't measure our own madness. At some point, I stopped working and just started watching. I stared at the screen showing orbital data and realized it was all theater. Neither side would win. Even if the ancients left, we had already destroyed what we were trying to save. People fought in space, cities burned on Earth, and the sun kept fading. It didn't interfere, didn't take revenge. It just grew colder, as if it was tired of our shouting. And I began to wonder if maybe the ancients gave us the choice not as a test of power, but as a test of character. Not to see if we could save the star, but to see if we could save ourselves. And honestly, I wasn't sure the answer. I still remember the day they first showed us the blueprint of a weapon capable of interfering with the very heart of the sun. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. We were about to challenge the gods. The lab was filled with a strange silence, not the usual kind when people are focused, but a heavy, viscous, almost sacred one. The project was meant to be humanity's final argument in its dispute with the ancients. It was called the Helios Shield, though, in truth, it was no shield at all, but a spear, a tool for direct intervention in the solar core. We were trying to seize control from those who, by their own words, had created the light. As I looked at the schematics, I thought this was no longer science, but pure magic. Humanity once again decided to play creator, unable to accept being reminded of its place. From the very beginning, it all looked like madness. We were building devices that operated on the edge of physics, and sometimes beyond it. Generators powered not by energy, but by gravitational distortions. Drones capable of flying near the solar corona without vaporizing. Artificial stabilization fields that could literally freeze the flow of plasma. Every day I walked into the lab, and the world became a little less real. Scientists argued, engineers went sleepless for days, and the military demanded results, because the ancients were sending signals more and more often, as if to say, time was running out. Officially, we called it a defense plan, but everyone knew it wasn't defense. It was an act of desperation. We weren't protecting the sun. We were trying to prove it belonged to us. The work moved at a frantic pace. No one thought about the consequences. I saw people I had known for years turn into zealots. They spoke of plasma streams and thermoquantum nodes as if they were talking about a living being. I didn't judge them. I had become one of them too. Every morning I felt we were standing on the threshold of the impossible. And at the same time, I knew that beyond that threshold could be the end of everything. Several times, we detected strange signals from the solar corona, as if someone was watching us. Maybe the ancients were monitoring the experiments. Maybe the sun itself was reacting to the interference. One of our engineers said it seemed angry, and for some reason, I believed him. On nights when anomalous auroras lit up the skies over Earth, I didn't feel wonder, but unease, as if someone was warning us, don't touch what you didn't create. When the first test succeeded, the whole world erupted in celebration. The news declared that humanity had taken control of the light. People filled the streets, celebrating, singing, though no one really understood what it meant. We, the engineers, knew. Nothing was over yet. Everything rested on a theory built from assumptions and calculations with no precedent. One failure, one wrong pulse, and the sun could explode, erasing everything we had ever created. But fear gave way to pride. We began to believe we could tamper with the machinery of the universe without paying the price. And as always, pride proved stronger than reason. I remember the moment I first saw the prototype activate. We watched from a subspace module positioned beyond Mercury's orbit. On the screens appeared a massive beam, not of light, but something gravitational, dense like metal. It pierced through the sun's corona and seemed to latch onto its core. Space around it warped, flashed, and for a moment, I thought the star screamed. Yes, screamed, not in sound, but in vibration. I felt the hair on my arms rise, and I realized we had done something we were never meant to do. That was the first time I felt true fear, not for myself, for everything alive. We weren't just playing with fire, we had started breaking it. Now, looking back, I understand that we acted out of fear. We wanted to protect ourselves from the incomprehensible, to control it so we wouldn't feel helpless. But deep down I knew. If the ancients truly created the sun, their technology wasn't just machinery. It was part of something greater, maybe even alive. And now we had driven a spear into it, convinced we could make it obey. The defense plan had become an assault, and science, the final weapon of pride. And as I watched it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sun would answer. The only question was when. When I first saw an arc of plasma flare across the sky above the sun, I realized a war had begun, one no one could stop. Not a war for territory or resources, but for an idea, for the right to exist. We called it the battle for the star, but in truth, it was humanity's final attempt to prove it wasn't just an accident in someone else's experiment. The sun looked strange then, almost alive, flaring in pain. Its surface pulsed, and it seemed that every burst was a heartbeat trying to break free from invisible hands. We, the participants of the Helios Shield mission, weren't witnesses. We were accomplices. I sat in my observation bay, watching thousands of ships form a defensive line along Mercury's orbit. Everything trembled, space, time, even logic itself. At first, it seemed the ancients had no intention of responding. Their ships, if they could even be called that, simply hovered above the solar corona. Enormous, motionless, as if made of both light and metal. They emitted no signals, launched no attacks. They just watched. But then, something changed. Space around them distorted, like water around a dropped stone, and that's when we knew they had started to act. A wave of unknown energy rippled from the sun toward us, passing through shields, through everything. Monitors flickered, instruments went haywire, and it felt as if reality itself was cycling through versions of its own existence. Some said it was a form of communication, others, an attack. But I saw my colleagues' faces, and they all showed the same thing: terror. This wasn't a weapon. It was a reminder that we were children playing with fire that was never ours. When the first human fleet opened fire in response, space itself ignited. Lasers and plasma torpedoes, magnetic vortices, antimatter blasts, all merged into a blinding storm. It felt as if the night sky had turned into a raging sea of light. I tried to record the data, but the instruments couldn't handle the overload. Against the sun's backdrop, the explosions looked like mosquito bites, but each one meant hundreds dead. We fought against machines that knew neither fear nor doubt. They moved with perfect precision, as if physics itself obeyed their will. And humans fought on emotion, on stubbornness, on that strange thing the ancients may never have known. The desperate faith that even if we lost, it would still be our choice. I saw one of our battleships, the Argus, go into a direct collision with an ancient object. The ship simply vanished, dissolving into light, but the impact managed to disrupt the enemy's field. A few of our cruisers broke through closer to the sun and launched resonance charges. No one knew what would happen. Some thought the sun's core would stabilize, others that it would explode. Honestly, I didn't believe either. Everything felt too vast for a human mind to truly grasp. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a war, but a dialogue, one where we screamed and no one heard us. Maybe they didn't want to destroy us. Maybe they just wanted to turn off the lamp we had forced to flicker. Then something began that I still can't explain. Space around the sun suddenly froze. All readings dropped to zero, radio contact cut out, and for a few seconds, everything was silent. So silent, I could hear my own heartbeat. And then, the sun flared. Not brighter, not hotter, but aware. The flash felt like a gaze. It passed through ships, through everything living and dead, and I thought it was judging us, like a parent looking at a child who broke something precious, yet is still loved. Then the sun's rays began to change. They formed a pattern, not random, not chaotic. A structure resembling a neural network, or maybe a map. Someone who survived the battle later said it was a code, an invitation or a warning. I don't know. I just watched as the light spread across the sky and felt an odd calm settle over me. Even now, years later, I'm still not sure who won that day. Humans, machines, or the sun itself. deciding we deserved a second chance. We called it a battle, but maybe it was a test to see if we could look at the light without going blind. When I think about it, it almost makes me laugh. We spent centuries trying to understand how the universe works and never once asked if it wanted us to know. Maybe the ancients came back just to remind us, light belongs to no one. But I still keep that image, the sun flaring in the shape of an eye. Sometimes, when I watch the sunrise, I feel like it remembers everything, and it's waiting for us to dare to look up again. I knew that if I pressed the button, I'd be gone. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that people would forget me or that I'd fade from memory. No, I'd be erased, split apart, scattered, turned into something between energy and light. Funny, after everything I'd seen, machines fighting for the sun, people killing each other over ideas, fear still felt ordinary, almost domestic. Like standing on a rooftop and looking down. Only beneath me wasn't a street, but the abyss of the solar core. And I had to step into it willingly. The protocol was called Prometheus. Ironic, isn't it? The man who stole fire, now returning it. I even laughed when I signed the consent form. But the laugh came out dry, more like a cough. I'm not a hero. I'm not the kind who sacrifices himself for humanity with grand last words. Honestly, I was just the only one who could start the system manually. The smart ones built the protocol, but only someone trained on Helios knew how to stabilize the resonance matrix so it wouldn't tear everything within 1 billion kilometers apart. I wasn't chosen, just left over. Others had families, children, responsibilities. I had a habit of staring at the sun longer than I should. When they told me the chance of survival was 0, I nodded. Not because I was brave, because something inside had already burned out. I'd lived too long watching humanity argue over who deserved the light. And for the first time, I wanted someone, even me, to make the right choice. The preparation took 8 hours, enough time to review an entire life, and still not understand why I agreed. The Helios 9 station trembled under gravitational turbulence, monitors flickering like blinking eyes. I sat inside the capsule and felt the air thicken, almost syrupy. Somewhere beyond the walls, the reactors hummed, the breath of a beast. The protocol required the operator to synchronize his neural signals with the core's field. In other words, to become part of the sun. No one knew what that really meant. In theory, I was supposed to merge with the energy, stabilize the process, and then cease to exist. In practice, no one ever came back. When the countdown hit 10, I suddenly remembered the smell of wet asphalt after rain. I don't know why. Maybe the brain always searches for something alive when it knows the end has come. When the process began, I expected pain, but there was none. There was light. It didn't blind, it absorbed. At first I felt my body, then the boundaries began to dissolve. I seemed to expand, to grow beyond the station, the orbit, the planets. Memories flared like sparks, faces, voices, stars. I heard something vast and infinite breathing beside me. Maybe it was those who created the sun. Maybe it was the sun itself. At one point, I realized I was no longer human, but not part of a machine either. I was light, not a metaphor, real light. I felt energy flowing through me, felt millions of kilometers of plasma responding to my pulse. And in that endless awareness, one simple thought appeared. Strangely clear. All living things just want to burn, not destroy, not conquer, just shine while they can. I saw Earth, a small blue sphere hanging in the dark. People who still didn't know if they had survived. Someone was probably standing on the shore then, looking up at the sky, watching the solar flares stabilize. They must have thought it was just a coincidence, another miracle of science. No one knew that at that moment I was inside, not as a body, but as a thought, as a thread connecting the light with those who loved it. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I realized I wasn't disappearing. I was simply changing. My flesh turned into a beam, into warmth, into the breath of a photon, and at the very moment the sun became steady and calm, I felt it, alive, aware, answering me. It didn't speak, but I understood. Thank you. Now that it's all over, I can't say where I am. Maybe I'm part of a ray breaking through morning clouds. Maybe I'm the warmth in someone's hands. Or maybe I'm still deep inside the star, whispering in its language so it doesn't forget to shine. People will probably argue about what happened, write reports, build monuments. But I don't want them to remember me. I just want them to look up at the sky and understand light isn't something that belongs to anyone. It's what you become when you decide not to be afraid. And if someday someone tries to turn off the sun again, I'll be there, in every spark, in every ray, because I am the sun, and I'm still alive. I didn't wake up from sound, but from light. It was different, soft, almost human. After all those months of red storms and dark eclipses, the morning looked impossibly calm. The sun was the sun again, round, alive, golden. It no longer trembled, no longer exhaled darkness. They said the stabilization had succeeded, that Helios had done the impossible. But everyone who had seen it with their own eyes knew something had changed in the very nature of light. It felt as if it was looking back. I stood on the observatory roof, feeling warmth touch my skin, not burning, but as if recognizing. That was the first time I thought, what if the sun remembers us now? Or maybe someone specific, the one who gave it everything so it could shine again. 3 months had passed since the station signal was lost. We called him simply the operator. No name, no titles. He became a legend, but not the kind found in books. More like a legend whispered between conversations when no one wants to believe a person could vanish like that. Scientists tried to explain everything rationally. Quantum fusion, conversion of matter into energy, a new form of existence. But the more they talked, the less certain it all sounded, as if it wasn't about science anymore. Sometimes, when the sun set and the sky turned amber, I thought I saw a pulse in the spectrum, steady, almost human. And in those moments, I thought that maybe he was still here, not dead, just part of what we now call light. The world changed after that war, but not the way people expected. There were no celebrations, no slogans shouted. Everyone grew quiet, attentive, as if afraid to disturb the sky itself. Borders between countries started to lose meaning, not because of politics, but because everyone suddenly realized how small we were to divide what belonged to the stars. On Mercury's orbit, the wreckage of ships remained, rusted ghosts of the battle, gleaming in the rays of a new dawn. No one tried to clear them. Let them stay as a reminder of how close we came to the edge. Scientists from the solar conglomerate now work on Project Aurora, a system capable of reproducing miniature stars in laboratories. They say it's the beginning of a new era. But in their eyes, there's still something of fear, as if they themselves aren't sure they've truly earned this light. And then, something strange happened. The radio telescopes on Mars started picking up signals similar to the sun's pulse, but not matching its frequency. We thought it was an error, interference, or reflection. But when the same pattern started repeating, one of the physicists said it was a code. Not human, but recognizable in structure. At first, it sounded like a conspiracy theory, until we saw the graphs. They were too deliberate. Someone or something was sending us a rhythm repeating a phrase from the old Helios station communication protocol. Observation continues. I remember how silence filled the lab. No one spoke, but everyone understood one thing. The ancients hadn't disappeared. They just stepped aside. They're watching, waiting, maybe to see what we do next. Sometimes, I think the sun is a window now. Not a deity, not a weapon, but a channel between those who came before us and those we will become. When I look at it, I feel a strange calm, as if everything we did wasn't for nothing. We survived the darkness, and now we can build again. Not for power, not for glory, for understanding. Humanity has always wanted to be more than it is. Maybe that's both our curse and our gift. We create until we become what we've created. Sometimes I think, if one day we can ignite our own sun, somewhere on the edge of the galaxy, in the void where no one sees, that will be the moment the ancients acknowledge us as equals. Or maybe that will be him, the one who once became the light, coming home. Now, every morning begins the same. I go out onto the same roof, drink coffee, and watch the rays fall on the panels of the old observation station. The dust glows golden, birds return to their roots, and life flows again. Sometimes it seems to me the light feels a little warmer. Maybe it's just imagination. Or maybe it's really smiling. Because now I know for sure the sun is alive. And maybe one day we will be too. Not just people, but creators. Those who ignite stars not for glory, but so that someone else, thousands of years later, can wake up in the morning and say, "It wasn't in vain."